It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce our next guest speaker, President Bill Clinton. As our nation's 42nd president, he ushered in an era of economic growth and prosperity. He's been just as successful as a private citizen, starting the Clinton Foundation, one of the fastest growing NGOs in the world. And through the Clinton Global Initiative, he's brought together thousands of world leaders, business executives, and innovative thinkers to take action on some of the world's most pressing problems. To date, the Clinton Global Initiative members have made more than 2,100 commitments, which have improved the lives of nearly 400 million people around the world. But I'm particularly excited to introduce him because he shares my obsession with energy efficiency, which he has called a no-brainer for creating jobs and reducing bills. My time and my passion of energy efficiency started long, long ago, perhaps 25 years ago, when I didn't really know about climate change, and the only reason I was obsessed about energy efficiency was I was simply cheap. Now, I'm not saying anything about President Clinton. President Clinton has been an early champion of seizing the clean energy opportunity as a way to put Americans to work, to strengthen our economy, and to protect our planet. He's been at the forefront of supporting energy innovation, encouraging U.S. manufacturing, and diversifying our transportation sector. Through the CGI America, he's been bringing together many of our country's leaders to tackle these issues. And we're grateful that he agreed to help head up President Obama's Better Buildings Challenge. It's an initiative focused on improving energy efficiency in commercial buildings. To date, over 60 companies, universities, hospitals, local governments, and others have committed upgrading 1.6 billion square feet of commercial and industrial space by 2020. President Clinton has been a strong voice in the fight against climate change. Major cities around the world are working with the Clinton Climate Initiative and the so-called C40 cities to combat climate change in ways that strengthen local economies. By helping cities reduce their carbon footprints, the Clinton Foundation is helping to cut or abate more than 2 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The Clinton Climate Initiative is also helping to improve building efficiency, restore forests, and advance solar and carbon capture storage technologies. As one of the world's energy leaders, we're honored that he could be here today, so please help me give a warm welcome to President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Chu, Undersecretary Majumdar. Thank you for your work at ARPA-E. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to be here. I'm not quite sure why I'm here because I'm not a scientist. I'm famously technologically challenged, and I'm really here to say go get 'em. But I would like to offer a few observations, and at least you'll know they're mine. One of the best things about being a former president, you can say whatever the heck you want. So I had all these notes, and here's what I did to them. So now I have to wear my glasses so I can read my scratching. One of the saddest things about being a former president is that nobody necessarily cares what you say anymore, but you can say what you want. I have gotten a briefing on what's happened so far. My friends Fred Smith and Lee Scott, I thank them for their participation and for the remarkable work that they've done to prove American companies can make money out of doing the right thing on energy. Ash Carter, who just spoke to you, was a distinguished member of the Clinton administration as well, and it's astonishing, I think, what the Pentagon is doing, especially the Army and the Navy, to try to build zero emissions military facilities. They have the Navy at 50% in biofuels. It's an amazing thing, and I'll say more about it in a moment. And I know Bill Gates spoke yesterday, He doubles the IQ of every room he walks in. And I have an extensive partnership with the Gates Foundation in an unrelated area. We build health systems around the world together. We try to bring economies of scale and affordability to malaria treatment and do a lot of other things in healthcare that enable us to try to have the kind of innovation in healthcare delivery, particularly in the developing world, that you are striving for here. So I'm glad to be here. It's exciting, but I want to point out why I think this is such an important time for this third conference on innovation to be occurring. First of all, there are some hazards to the innovation project right now. We have massive new recovery technologies in oil and gas, which could lead us down the primrose path of thinking we don't have to keep using less energy and developing clean energy and new technologies. We've gone from a high of 62% oil imports to less than 50% just in the last few years. North Dakota has used these new recovery technologies in oil and gas to drive its unemployment rate down to 3.6%, a rate the rest of the country would kill for. And a lot of people are tempted to say, well, let's just go for this and nothing else. The unemployment rate has dropped to 8.3%, but if the workforce participation rate, that is, the people looking for jobs, were the same today as it was the day I left office, the unemployment rate would be well over 10%, not counting the number of people in part-time jobs who are looking for full-time jobs. And we're the only major country in the world that has one political party where apparently it's ideologically imperative to deny the reality of climate change. Budget. The budget constraints, which are leading Congress to tell everybody they've asked for too much money, could force us to give in to an easy temptation not to continue to invest more and more and more in innovation and research, which I think is one of the government's most important priorities. On the other hand, there are a lot of pluses about this time. All the exciting discoveries and avenues of research that you've already been discussing. The evidence that we now have that is abundant that investments in changing the way we produce and consume energy can launch an enormous economic boom for our country and for the world. And the fact that even when the government's role is uncertain, we have this huge venture capital machine in America that continues to invest in clean energy, almost $56 billion in 2011 alone. The sector continued to grow through 2008 and 2009 when the economy was suffering. Also, the recent spike in gas prices reminds us of the fragility of relying on just the way we used to do things, not to mention the increasingly apparent costs of fossil fuels on our health and our ecosystem. Al Gore recently led a very distinguished group of Americans and people from around the world on a trip to Antarctica, and I talked to one of the people who made the trip, who said to me, I just wish every person could go to the South Pole in the summertime down there and look at it and be told by people who know what it used to look like and what its role in the world's ecosystem is. But that's not going to happen. And so we're left with a time of real excitement here that probably won't make the front page of the Washington Post tomorrow, unless I say something outrageous which will embarrass the Secretary of State. And so The first challenge you face is to try to close the gap between the trend lines, which for you are exciting and thrilling and good, and the headlines, many of which could have been written 100 years ago now. We are making progress. I'll never forget when Al Gore went to Kyoto, Japan in 1997 to try to close the deal that Stu Eisenstadt and others have been working on, and we got an imperfect but at least first significant agreement of the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Senate voted against it 95-0. I think before Al Gore got off the airplane. And I know before I sent them the treaty. It's the only bill I ever lost in Congress before I sent it up. Why? Because then the consensus, the bipartisan consensus was that the only way for a country to grow rich, stay rich, and get richer was to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And I had basically committed America to a pact that would end civilization as we know it. Now, nobody believes that now. Earlier this year in a congressional hearing that I was stunned, received almost no publicity, America's principal climate skeptic, Professor Mueller from the University of California at Berkeley, testified before a committee of the House expecting him to deny climate change. He had raised what I thought was the only serious question about the whole methodology of all the studies of the last few years. He said, I think too many of these climate measurements are being taken too close to urban areas, and they're always hotter than non-urban areas, which is true. I live 20, 25 miles north of New York City, and when I leave my house in the morning, by the time I get to my office in Harlem, it's always 10 degrees warmer. It's just self-evidently true. So he did 3.6 billion temperature measurements, correcting for what he thought were the methodological errors of previous ones, and he testifies before this expectant committee full of people ideologically opposed to the very idea of climate change and changing the way we produce and consume energy, and he said, well, I did it, and I was wrong, and they're right. The world is warming at an unsustainable pace, and it's caused by human activities. I corrected for all the mistakes I thought were there. I got exactly the same results. Please do it. As far as I could tell, it didn't make the evening news. It wasn't a front page story in any newspaper. It was a trend line, but not a headline. So I want to say to all of you, the American people are basically with you in this enterprise. They basically support what you're doing. But they have all they can say grace over, keeping body and soul together. And in politics, the position that is popular is not what carries the day. It's the position that has the most intensity behind it. And so one of the things I hope you will all do, in addition to what you are here to do, is to realize that there is a citizenship component here which requires us to raise the knowledge level of our citizens and the intensity level of their understanding that our economic future is not threatened by what you're doing. It depends on the success of what you are doing. Now, as I said in a little book I wrote on what happened in the last 30 years and what I think should be done now, I am a huge fan of President Obama's energy strategy and his Secretary of Energy. I like this, all of the above strategy, as long as we are moving toward a substantial reduction in greenhouse gases with growth. And I think that the best example of how we should make decisions, and it's so different from how decisions are often made in political environments today, was the agreement with all the stakeholders to dramatically increase the mileage capacity of automobiles. You had the company, the union, the government, the environmental groups, and an agreement that will dramatically reduce our reliance on oil, dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and over the next few years, create 150,000 new jobs. And that needs to be hammered home. When Walmart just reduced its packaging by 5%, it had the effect of taking 211,000 diesel trucks off the road, and it saved the company's supply chain $3.6 billion that could be devoted to other things. FedEx has a carbon neutral information technology center in Colorado already. When Germany adopted its heavily subsidized leap into solar power, I have to say even I was skeptical. After all, in Germany, the sun shines on average as much as it does in London. But Deutsche Bank did a study, not Greenpeace, Deutsche Bank, which estimated that the Germans had netted 300,000 jobs out of it. During the same period, even before the Europeans adopted their 20-20-20 strategy, Sweden grew its economy 50% and reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 7%. Denmark grew its economy 75% and kept its emissions constant, with the result that they did not have an increase in income inequality that we and most other wealthy countries have experienced. Wages rose, and the country moved with confidence into the future. So, by way of background, what does that mean? What should we actually do? First of all, I think the government should invest even more money in ARPA-E and its ability to connect with other research centers, like-minded public and private and mixed efforts throughout the country. The agency was created in 2007, bill passed by a Democratic Congress, signed by President Bush, and then got a real jolt of money from the stimulus package after President Obama took office. I was thinking about this the other day. There was a wonderful article, which I'm sure you saw, Mr. Secretary, in the New York Times yesterday about the role of Bell Labs in America's life, and pointing out that you won your Nobel Prize for work you did while you were at Bell Labs. And the argument of the article, and the author of the article has written a whole book on the subject, was that Bell Labs might be a better model for what we need in the future than some of the developments of the best American companies today, because they could really work on long-term developments and huge fixes, huge developments that would change the way we live and work in fundamental ways. If ARPA-E is at the apex of a network of other research efforts, they can do that. They can be nimble and fast, and everything's faster now than it was 30 years ago, but they can still have the luxury of doing long-term investments in discoveries that could change our world in ways that I can't imagine. I think we have to make a commitment to that. And I believe we need to try to build within the Congress a bipartisan consensus for that. When we had a similar upheaval in American politics in 1994, and a different group, the pre-Tea Party Congress, won a majority in 95, the head of the National Institutes of Health was another Nobel Prize winner, Harold Varmus. He did a very clever thing. He brought out all the new members of Congress to the National Institutes of Health, and he actually took them into their patient centers and laid them in beds and showed them what they were doing. And since they all wanted to live forever, they voted for like all the rest of us, they voted for generous appropriations in areas that we needed. We need to do that here. The research budget of the United States is very limited compared to the size of the deficit, the size of the debt, the size of the annual budget. And If you look at what's going on here, it would be a terrible mistake not to do that. The second thing I think we have to do is to always have people who are expert in more rapid transfer of these technologies to practical use. Thirdly, following up on what Ash Carter just said, I think we need even more reliance on the military. The military is the largest user of energy in the federal government, I think, in the whole country. But their capacity to organize and execute change is unparalleled. And one of my great frustrations is even when we know something is profitable and pays well, we have a hard time taking changes to scale in a complex environment. I want to say a little more about that in a minute. But if the military wants to build 20 facilities, the Army, Secretary McHugh wants to build 20 facilities that are carbon neutral within a few years, why not help him build 50? If the public fleet alone of the military and non-military vehicles could make electrical vehicles economic alone, why not give them the support to do it? If the Navy wants to have half of its planes fly on biofuels by 2020, why not help them exceed it and get the Air Force in on the act? And there are lots of things here that we can do with the military I think we should do more of. Fourth thing I think we should do is to try to remove the ambivalence that still exists over whether natural gas should be a bridging fuel. We're going to take that out of the ground. It's obviously happening. And America has become a net fuel exporter for the first time in a long time recently. I come from Arkansas, which is a big natural gas state, and we just found a lot more. But I live in New York, which is coming to grips with all the legitimate environmental questions that have been raised about fracking. And one thing I've noticed is this. In my native state, even the most conservative pro-industry people readily accept appropriate safeguards on what should be done with the tailings and the contaminations of water that come up. And they understand the hazards, and they think it should be a part of the production process, taking good care of it. If there's the remotest chance of contaminating flowing water, usually the fracking occurs well below any groundwater, they readily accept that. One of the most amazing things to me about this Keystone Pipeline deal is that they ever filed that route in the first place, since they could have gone around the Nebraska Sound Hills and avoided most of the danger, no matter how imagined, to the Ogallala with a different route, which I presume we'll get now, because the extra cost of running it is infinitesimal compared to the revenues that will be generated over a long period of time. So I think we should embrace it and develop a stakeholder-driven system of high standards for doing the work, modeled on what was done with the auto mileage agreement. I think, finally, we need more innovation to implement what works now in the low-hanging fruit area. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. When North Dakota got so much publicity recently as having a 3.6% unemployment rate for their oil and gas, there was nowhere mentioned in any of the articles that when President Bush was in office, the Energy Department said they also have enough wind to generate 25% of America's electricity if they had a grid that would take the power from where the wind blows to where the people live and work. In fact, enough wind blows from North Dakota's border with Canada down to West Texas's border with Mexico to electrify America many times over, but almost without exception, the wind blows where the people aren't. And I still think that's worth doing. I'll say a little more about how I think it should be done, but I think this is very important. The best way to finance this, in my opinion, is with an infrastructure bank that once had bipartisan support. If you just put a little bit of money in from the taxpayers, a few $1 billion, you could match it and then some by making a deal while we're talking about tax reform to get corporations to invest in the rest because of the returns. And let me just say what I mean by that. I'm the last person to actually raise corporate taxes. And I did it at a time when we went to a 35% rate as a part of the effort to balance the budget and bring the deficit down and bring interest rates down in 1993. The rate I chose put us squarely in the middle of wealthy countries so that it was not an uncompetitive rate. Also, many other countries at the time taxed corporate income the way we do. That is, if it was earned overseas and they repatriated it, you had to pay the difference between the American rate and whatever was paid overseas. Today, none of the other OECD countries do that. And the average rate is not 35% anymore, it's 24 or 25, something like that. So clearly what we have to do, since some corporations pay well under 20, is to do what we did with individual rates in 83. We need to broaden the base, reduce the deductions, and lower the rates. In the process of doing that, I think a short-term fix, we should allow the companies to repatriate the money right away, and to avoid what happened the last time we did it when President Bush was in office, when all the money was repatriated and then put back into the company into to dividends or pay increases. We should give the companies a choice. If you want to do whatever you want with the money, pay the long-term capital gains rate until we change the corporation law, because they're eventually going to get, we'll have to treat them the way everybody else does. We can't be the only country in the world that taxes this money differently than other countries. If you want to bring it back for free, you can, but you have to put it into the infrastructure bank, where you will get good guarantees returns, and we will have the capital necessary, among other things, to modernize the transmission system so that we can put the energy where the people are. I think that we should do more in America and around the world to pick the low-hanging fruit that has now been well documented for the last couple of years of the more rapidly dispersing greenhouse gases. The Secretary of State recently announced an initiative with 6 countries, 3 developed countries, 3 developing countries, to work to reduce methane gas, black carbon, mostly from burning charcoal and cook stoves, and CFCs, which disperse into the atmosphere much more rapidly than carbon. This is hugely important. If we could do this on a systematic global basis, it would buy us maybe 20 more years to avoid the worst calamities of climate change, while all of you come up with great new ideas, some of which will really work and make a huge difference. So it's very important. But we Americans should set an example. I don't think there should be any open landfill in any big city in the United States of America, not one. And I think that there are clearly technologies which also help farmers to reduce methane emissions from animal waste on farms, and we ought to have a systematic way of doing this. We work in my foundation with Lagos, Nigeria, with Mexico City, with Delhi, with a number of big cities around the world, trying to help them to recycle all the plastic, metal, and glass, take all the organic material out of their landfills and turn it into fertilizers for farmers, and then in some form or fashion prevent methane emissions, either capturing the methane for power generation or actually compacting what's rest and using it as a direct fuel. which can be used to generate electricity or to provide co-generated steam for manufacturing, depending on the size of the landfill and its location. We should do that everywhere. The cost of that, if you pay it out at an affordable, competitive electric rate, you probably would take 17 years or so to pay it out. 17, 18 years. Sounds like a long time. If you build a coal-fired power plant in any state in this country, you get 20 years to pay it off through higher rates and higher emissions. Most states will give you 30 years to pay off a nuclear power plant. And there's a federal guarantee on some of the losses that can attend the construction of a nuclear plant. This is not rocket science. We need a system in America if we're going to be working with developing countries on the more rapidly dispersing greenhouse gases to do what we can here. And the best thing we could do here is to go after methane and prove that there are affordable, financeable models that can be implemented in other places around the world. Finally, I think we need a modernization that's sort of beyond what most of you are interested in, but we need a technological fix to finance efficiency. We know as a practical matter that energy efficiency is good. I have been, as the Secretary said, the President invited me to work on his buildings initiative because our foundation does that around the world. When I leave you tomorrow, I'm flying to Chicago, where the mayor of Chicago has raised a ton of money to do a whole range of really innovative, impressive things that will be announced tomorrow, much of which relates to efficiency. But we have not developed a system to do this everywhere. Most of you know, I think, that the Empire State Building recently underwent a top-to-bottom retrofit. And it's cut emissions and the utility bill by 40%. Now the Empire State Building, built in 1931, will be the oldest big building in the world with a LEED rating. But they actually cleared off a floor, put in a factory, cut all the glass for new windows, changed all the heating and air conditioning systems, put in temperature controls, changed the lighting, the whole 9 yards, and they reduced emissions by 40%. They worked with, our foundation did some work there, but their main technology partner was Johnson Controls, who guaranteed them 38%. So I knew they'd get more than 38%, because if they get less, Johnson Controls has to make up the difference, and businesses don't get very far paying people to work for them. They like to get paid when they do work. But the Empire State Building is a Tony address. People like to be there, so they had the cash reserves necessary to finance this. In 4.5 years, slightly less than that if they actually hit 40% or more savings, they will recover their investment, after which their bills will, in effect, drop dramatically. For power, they will have created 275 full-time jobs for the approximately 2 years it took to do this, and they will have cleaned up a lot of air. The Merchandise Mart in Chicago, our biggest building, underwent a retrofit. When I first started talking about this, people said, "Oh, you're crazy. There's 5 companies like Johnson, Siemens, Honeywell that have 90+% of the market. It's a $7 billion a year market. You think it ought to be a $50 billion or $100 billion a year market, and that's unrealistic." It's unrealistic if you expect those 5 companies to do it. But if you retrofit my old high school in Hot Springs, Arkansas, one of those companies is not going to do it. Now there are software programs available for bonded contractors to go in, spend the day, figure out what can be done, what the likely savings are, and guarantee them. And they're looking for ways to do this. This is a huge deal for America's biggest unemployment problem: non-college educated, middle-aged people who can do this work, men and increasingly women. And that will all be guaranteed. But there is no national just say yes system here. There are lots of options, but the main thing you need to know is you get 7,000 to 8,000 jobs for every $1 billion expended in this area. This is the biggest return on jobs per dollar invested of anything we can be doing now. And according to the Center for American Progress report a couple of years ago, we can get halfway home to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 through efficiency measures alone. So a lot more effort needs to be put into getting to just say yes systems. And I just want to, and the return on investment's substantial. Now the options are fairly clear. California and one or two other places, a couple of cities in California, have adopted the so-called PACE systems, where if you do homes, you just put it on your property tax bill over time, and the addition per year to your property tax bill does not exceed your savings in that year from your utility bill, so you have a just say yes system. The biggest obstacle to doing that nationally is the opposition from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Because just like they're opposing the write-down of home mortgages, they say it erodes the taxpayer's investment. But that's not true in this case. The different answer to the mortgage issue, and that is to let them have a piece of the profits on the back end. But here, it's simply not true. If you retrofit a home, you make it more valuable to the next buyer. And by putting it on the property taxes, you allow the bill to be paid off even if the ownership of the building change. And it's just not true that it undermines the value of the mortgage that Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac holds. It's simply not true. The house is worth more, not less, if it is retrofitted. But this, I think, rather sterile and meaningless debate has kept the Congress from authorizing this nationwide. So that's one option. The other option, and my favorite by far, is decoupling, allowing the utilities to finance directly so the contractor doesn't have to go to a bank, by simply allowing the utilities to charge more per kilowatt hour when fewer kilowatt hours are used until the retrofit is paid off. 20 states authorize decoupling for electricity or natural gas or both. And there's some evidence that it's becoming more popular now. 33 years ago, in my first year as governor of Arkansas, God, I'm getting old, I got the legislature to approve decoupling. For 32 years, the biggest utility in our state, which is now called Energy, opposed it. And so the Public Utility Commission would never mandate it over the opposition of the utility. Then they decided they wanted it, unbelievably enough, and they were sued by the industrial users because the industrial users get smaller, lower per kilowatt hour charges, saying that somehow this would raise their rates. It won't, but they thought it would. And in one of the neatest twists of irony in my lifetime, after 32 years, the utility hired the same two lawyers to defend them that wrote the legislation for me that they opposed. We don't have 32 years to effect these changes anymore. And this is just one small state. But it's a huge thing. If every utility in America were seriously engaged in this, you would have a just say yes system that would apply to homes, to small businesses, and to larger buildings. And it would make a big, big difference. Short of that, New York's recent adoption of on-bill financing is pretty close. That is, they just cut your utility bill and they add the financing of the retrofit 2-year bill so you can see that the two of them together are no bigger than their utility bill was before. It's going to create several thousand jobs in New York. It's already got a lot of home retrofit operations up and going in our state. Then the electric co-ops and the municipally owned utilities can just do it direct without asking for anybody's approval. In Nebraska, several communities are doing this now, and they do an in and out. One day we'll tell you how much you save. Just pick the day we come and go. But the frustration that I have, the president and I went out and did an office building in downtown D.C. that was being retrofitted. It's a wonderful story, and it made good news coverage. But the people who were watching it didn't necessarily know how they could follow suit or whether they could follow suit. So for those of you who are involved in this, I would say that if you're looking for a way to generate jobs in a hurry and to buy time, the best things to do are to focus on, while you're developing new technologies, getting rid of the rapidly dispersing greenhouse gases and being much more systematically effective in energy efficiency. We are making some progress there. Interestingly enough, last year at the Clinton Global Initiative meeting for the United States, the AFL-CIO committed to raise $10 billion to do this. And that's a lot of money. That's more money than we were putting into it for a year before. And so we've already gotten a couple of California pension funds and others interested in doing it, and other funds. We can give a pretty good rate of return, and we're putting the deals together now. But in research, it's a good thing to have all of you doing your thing. But if you know what the answer is, it's not a good thing if you've got 100 different people doing their thing and it all adds up to a small percentage of a big challenge, when you know if you did it at 80% of the potential target, you'd get huge numbers of jobs, drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and buy time for all these technological developments to be fully implemented. So for any of you who are involved in that, I ask you to think about that. Because I think that we are really paying a price for not doing at larger scale the simple, low-hanging things that we know how to do now, but we haven't been able to modernize the finance for. And that will buy more time for ARPA-E and for all of you to find all the silver bullets that can be found. Finally, let me say that I'm very, very optimistic about this. And I think all of you are too. I'm gratified by the fact that the President and the administration and the Department of Defense, knowing that budget cuts are coming and they need to find ways to be more efficient in order to modernize our force and still maintain the physical structures, the planes, the ships, the other things that we'll have to have, are on the cutting edge. I'm gratified by the fact that no matter what has happened up and down with the uncertainty of the tax incentives relating to solar, wind, geothermal, and other things, we've had this incredible venture capital network in America that has continued to be committed to this and to believe in this. But the last thing I will say is to repeat what I said earlier. Once people know the facts, nobody's against this. But there are still too few non-college educated, unemployed, or underemployed Americans who understand what a huge impact this could be on their future. There are still too few people that understand there are already more people working in clean energy than in traditional energy. There are still too few people who intensely believe that the consequences of climate change can be calamitous and that there are wildly profitable ways to avoid it. And that's why I tried to give some very practical suggestions today. The longer I live, the less interested I am in giving speeches, and the more interested I am in just doing one thing, just one thing that proves that you can do the right thing and earn a profit doing it, create jobs doing it, give kids a better future doing it. The American people need to know that so that the intensity of support for your work equals the intensity of those who seem to be still intent on denying its significance. This is a great time to be alive. We just have to make sure more people understand it and more people participate in it. Thank you very much.